in Chicago that have looked at who uses parks, what they get out of it, what they like about certain parks and not others. But it can be really difficult in these sorts of studies to compare across a bunch of different parks, for example, to compare across cities, to compare across different land use types, which is something that I'm interested in. And so this data could be complementary in being able to get some of that breadth as opposed to that depth of information. And also, there have been a lot of efforts recently by researchers to use social media data to ask some of these questions that are relevant to urban conservation. So a couple SESYNC projects actually have looked at things like use social media as a proxy for visitation rates at different parks and then predicting which parks people like to go to more. So using like the frequency of Twitter posts, for example. Or assessing aesthetic value from how many pictures people take at different lakes and how that's related to water quality. There's also a group that's worked here that's looked at people's risk perception from hazards like flooding, including in cities, from Twitter. And then there are some other kind of new things that people are doing, like looking at using photos to look at what kinds of activities people are participating in different places. So there's some stuff to work on in this realm. What I'm going to talk about today is a project that I've been working at that's trying to get at the synergy between biodiversity and sort of these tangible benefits that people actually recognize. And so what I'm interested in is where people are appreciating biodiversity within the city of Chicago. And by where, I'm really interested in sort of these different areas that could provide conservation benefits or opportunities for people to observe biodiversity. So more typically, what we would think of for conservation spaces are like nature preserves, and in Chicago there's a set of forest preserves that sort of ring the city. There's also a lot of parks and greenways, but there are these other kind of opportunities to, like, biodiversity is harbored on places that you might not expect, like golf courses and cemeteries, and there are people studying that in Chicago, as well as in residential areas. So I'm really interested in which places people are using to observe biodiversity, and specifically how important are these more conservation areas versus other kinds of land uses. And I'm specifically going to talk about birds because people like them. Birding is like a huge industry. And I feel bad picking on Billy because he's not here, but he's actually asked me before, like, so tell me about this birding thing, because there are obviously certain demographics of people who are more interested in birding, more like old people. He was very confused that people our age would actually be interested in going out and looking at birds. He was like, wait, so do you just like watch them? But it is a thing that a lot of people do, and there's some data about where people do it. So one website that I'm using is eBird, which is a tool that's used a lot by the birding community, where people can keep track of records of where they see birds, when things are migrating. Also, you can use it to go online and see, like, oh, where's this migrating bird right now in Annapolis? What park can I go to see this cool purple gallinule or whatever, something. And they explicitly have a science and conservation mission, so they make their data available and use it for species distribution modeling and other kinds of efforts, considering this to be citizen science data. Another app that's becoming increasingly popular is called iNaturalist, which is really targeted at nature lovers. It allows people to learn new species because you can take a picture of something, put it online, and even if you don't know what it is, there are experts that go check it out and might be able to tell you. And they actually host sort of an urban biodiversity thing, which actually just ended yesterday, where they had a challenge between a bunch of different cities to see how many people they could get out looking for species within a certain amount of time. How many species they could get, stuff like that. And I love this quote, a full 96 hours of pure nature nerdery. And then I also am using data from Flickr, which is not a biodiversity specific site, but is a place where people put pictures. So this is more of a social media site where people can share pictures online or just keep it as sort of like a storage program. This was a lot more popular, I'd say maybe like 10 years ago, but you can get data from them, which is great. And a lot of people who have nice cameras use this, I would say. There's a huge caveat to using this kind of data to try to understand where people are observing biodiversity, which is that it's observing biodiversity and then putting it online. So obviously, this is not capturing every time somebody sees a bird and is like, oh, that's a cool bird. You have to see the bird. Sometimes you have to get a good photo of it. You have to probably have this app on your phone and put it online, or you have to keep a record and then add it in later. So this is just getting a small and probably biased sample, but I think that it can still tell us something about where people are observing birds. I want to shout out to Kelly, who helped me make this, maybe not easy to see, but Shiny app, which I use to go through my Flickr photos, because when you search for the word bird, you get a lot of stuff that's not birds. So we call this bird Tinder, because the point of it is to say, yes, this is a bird, no, this is a bird, swipe left, swipe right. Someday we will have an app for this with swiping. But so you can see the bird, you can code in a bunch of things that you might be interested in, and then it actually changes it in your data set. It's pretty cool. So I use data from these 3 sites. These are my sort of search terms, or how I filtered that data, from 2015 to 2017 within the city limits of Chicago. And I'm not going to talk about this right now, but you can ask if you're curious. But we decided to only look at 1 observation per person per location, because we are interested in places where people are observing birds, not every observation of birds that people got. And then for which places, we took a couple different ways of looking at this. So we looked at land use using the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning land use data. And we categorized, or kind of lumped their categories into what we were interested in, which was open space, considering conservation areas, recreation areas, and then other kinds like golf courses and cemeteries, residential areas, and then water, roads and right-of-ways, and everything else. We also wanted to know if there were these spatial distributions across different neighborhoods in Chicago, and so we used these 77 community areas, which have been pretty consistent over the last many decades. There's 77 of them. They're used for censuses and stuff. The census tracts kind of go within there. And we used data to predict where there are more bird observations in these different neighborhoods and where there are less. Survey data from the American Community Survey, 5-year estimates of income, age, and population density. We also looked at the land use kind of area of open space and residential, the location, so the distance to Lake Michigan, which is here, and then the area of the. How do you get age? That's in the community survey. Oh. They have, yeah, median age, yeah, in the census, yep. So just going right to results, this is a sort of blurry map. Sorry about that. But so the eBird observations are in purple, and you can kind of see that they actually follow these main roads, which was kind of surprising to me. iNaturalist are more spread out throughout the city, and Flickr observations are really along the water and close to the downtown. And part of that might be because some of these are tourists, and that's not something that I've actually looked at yet, but you can sometimes get that information from Flickr. So looking at the land use, I'm going to show a couple graphs that show the % of observations with bars. So here are my categories of open space, water, roads and right-of-ways. The 2 categories of residential and other will be at the bottom. So we found, I'm just going to skip to this, there was more open space than most of the other kinds of categories. There was a lot along roads and right-of-ways, and that was mostly from the eBird. There was a lot less in residential areas. And when, yeah, so this is just highlighting those recreation areas was actually, to me, sort of surprisingly a higher proportion of where we saw these observations. Oh, sorry, I just touched the mic. Hope that didn't screw anything up. We compared those proportions of the observations to the area that's actually within the city to see if there was like significantly different from what you would expect. And there was a significant difference between these 2 distributions. Particularly, the area that's taken up by open space is a lot smaller than the proportion of observations we found in open space, and the residential area has the opposite. Whereas with roads, it's like almost exactly the same. So then we looked at neighborhoods, and it was very variable how many observations there were in different neighborhoods. Just so these are preliminary analyses. Chris Field is helping me fit a Bayesian model to incorporate some of the the error in the American Community Survey estimates and deal with some weird distributions. But so we found that income had one of the strongest relationships with how many observations there were in different neighborhoods. This is just a graph of that. But there was also more observations in places with more people that live there, which is not too surprising. There were more observations in places that had more area of open space and less in more residential neighborhoods. There were fewer observations the farther you got from the lake, which in Chicago also is often farther that you get from the downtown area. And there were more observations in larger neighborhoods, which is also just something I wanted to control for. So just to summarize these results that we've gotten so far in this project. So recreation areas were surprisingly important for people seeing birds, which means that people are kind of using these places that they are probably going to a lot of the times for other reasons and observing birds there. So it might be sort of this, there are some papers now about sort of these incidental human-nature interactions in cities, which could be really important for, yeah?
So I'm from Chicago. So,
yeah.
The park districts, you know, typically have bike trails.
Mm-hmm.
Does that count, or was that tricky for you? Would you count a park district as a conservation area or a recreation?
Well, so this is like, I'm using the CMAP, had actually designated that, and the way that they did it is if it has less or more than 50% infrastructure, like non-vegetation, which is perhaps, it doesn't actually get into the intention of those spaces, but that's the way that it's defined in this study, yeah. So also the amount of open space at a neighborhood scale also influences how many observations you get, which I thought was interesting. But other land uses are also really important, and so this is one of the things that we wanted to get at with this study. So roadways and right-of-ways are surprisingly places where people are making a lot of observations. And these are probably fortuitous sightings by people who know birds really well. So people who are like on their way to work, spot something, and then later on eBird, because in eBird, if you know the location and the time, you don't need a picture, you can put it in. And so people are probably seeing cool things and then reporting it later. This is a little tangential, but one of the things that I'm interested in looking at is like which birds, what kinds of birds people are looking at, because that might mean that these are skewed towards like more cool or unusual birds along roads. Residential areas are used a lot by a few people. So I mentioned that we took, for the analyses I showed you, we looked at one observation per place, yeah, per person. So, but when you don't do that filtering, there are certain houses that come up as having just tons and tons and tons and tons of observations and like really skew the results, because there are some people who just like are these every day in their neighborhood or in their yard will go out and look at birds, but they're not really having this benefit of biodiversity necessarily for as many people. Water is really important, being close to water and observations on water. This is a local attraction in Chicago. Also, there might be some effect of it being easier to get a better picture. And then there are these gaps across neighborhoods and where people are reporting these biodiversity observations. So lower income areas, further from the lake and downtown. And then also, I haven't actually looked at other kind of demographic features, but when I looked at the places that have no observations that have a lot of green space, those are African-American neighborhoods. And so there might be either, there might be a kind of thing of who's using this particular technology, which is definitely geared towards certain kinds of people, but then also there might just be cultural things of like both who has the free time and inclination to be a birder and then to like put these things online. So these are still things that I'm very much kind of trying to figure out how to disentangle. But I think that there are some implications from this work as it stands. So non-conservation areas, we kind of know this already, but this backs up the idea that these non-conservation areas have conservation potential, particularly for education and outreach and people actually sort of having these incidental human-wildlife interactions. I think this shows a little bit along with some of the other work that people are doing, how social media can be used to capture some of these hard to measure benefits of urban conservation, like things that people are actually noticing and experiencing and appreciating. And my proposed work, which this is a little bit tangential to, which I plan to start working on soon, is like using Twitter data to look at people's sentiments in different areas of the city, in different kinds of green space, whether people are doing different activities and different things. And so I think that there's a lot of potential for using this data for things like that. And then this is something that I didn't really talk about the results, but those land use categories, we did see some different patterns in the different platforms. So we thought that because these are used by somewhat different groups of people, that putting them together might give us a better picture of what's going on for people more broadly. But there are some interesting differences between them that might have implications for both on a practical level, people using these data and trying to bring in other data sources to improve species distribution models and stuff like that. Like people are going to different places, people might be seeing different birds. But I also think that there might be some potential to kind of look into these differences to get an idea of who these different people are and what they're getting out of these bird observations. So just an example of that, I think that doing some kind of analysis of what's in these pictures and what people are saying about them could be really tell you something about whether people are really appreciating sort of the aesthetic value that birds are providing to the scene. This particular bird, this guy wrote this whole thing under the photo about how he had raced across the city to see this particular kind of plover that he had like to add to his list. This is 2 different species of swan that you might not be able to tell. So there's like I learned how to identify these 2 different species of swan and I took a picture of it. So there are kind of these different reasons why people might appreciate biodiversity. And then I'm also interested in, from these different platforms, figuring out potentially ways of including some sort of detection probability using some of the data for like who's using these sites at all, or are people at these places using these sites, and then does that help predict if people are observing birds using those sites? So I've talked to Chris Field a little bit about that and some people that I met at a conference recently. So I got a lot of future directions, but I'm happy now to just take any questions that you have. Thanks for listening. Yeah?
This is so cool. Thank you. I learned a lot. You pulled the data over 2 years?
Yes.
And I think Chicago has winters.
They do, yeah.
Have you thought about looking at seasons?
Yeah, I've done a little bit of looking at the temporal trends, and what I was really interested in with that, well, okay, I guess one thing is that I'm thinking that this could be 2 papers. I'm still not totally convinced that what I have so far is like enough to be a paper on its own because there are so many caveats, but I think that doing more investigation into differences between the different platforms could be another study, and that's what I was looking at with the temporal trends, is because you see these different trends where it seems like eBird pretty closely matches when birds are migrating, because birders like know when that's going to happen. There's also, I was talking to Chris Field about this the other day, there could be some potential to use eBird data to look at whether there are these trends in the data of somebody seeing a bird and then everyone going there to see that bird, and then, anyway. And then, like iNaturalist, Flickr kind of matches up with the eBird data, and iNaturalist doesn't, I think is what I found, which is pretty interesting. But iNaturalist is also sort of heavily influenced, depending on how, if you don't do that filtering of the data, by these like BioBlitz events or like the City Nature Challenge, where you get a ton of people in one space for a certain amount of time to identify as many species as they can. So there are some weird things with these data sets, but I think that that's also a good thing to look at. Yeah?
I'm sort of stuck on the socioeconomic issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just missed what you said about the survey.
Yeah.
How was the survey done?
Oh, this is the like U.S. Census American Community Survey, which is Carrie can explain much better than me, although she did give us a
But how
talk
does
on
that
it the other
relate to
day.
your areas? I mean,
So, oh, yes, I get it. So I use data from census tracts, which are within those community
Right.
surveys, and then so far, I've just looked at like a mean of those census tracts within each community survey.
So you're looking at the demographics associated with the region, not the
With-
people that go there.
Yeah.
And I assume most of the conservation areas and nice parks are in areas with higher socioeconomic.
To some extent, but I mean, I guess one thing that I found from including both like income and amount of open space is that they both have additive effects. So there is a relationship between those, although I don't think it's quite as strong as I thought it would be. But then they also are both having an influence on. So I think, I mean, there's still the major issue of that it doesn't say anything about who's actually doing the observing, which as far as I know, I can't actually find out from this data. But I think that there still could be very real influence. I wanted to use this neighborhood scale because I thought that in some way might be more intuitive than other units of measure of people being like, oh, I'm gonna go to this neighborhood, or I don't go to that neighborhood. So if people are going somewhere to bird or go to a park or whatever in a neighborhood that's not where they're from, I figure that they might have some sort of neighborhood association that they would know about. So I don't know who's first. Maybe I think Maya was maybe.
So my question is, this project is really focusing very specifically on Chicago.
Mhm.
You're mentioning some of these patterns, like people birding along the water and how that could be close to the downtown. I'm just wondering if you use a few other major cities, if you might be able to tease out whether or not it is the water effect, or if it is the downtown,
Yeah.
or if there's some of these other factors that you can't necessarily know from just one city.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that could. I've definitely thought about expanding this to other cities, and I think that that's a really good reason to do that. Yeah. Yeah. There's different land cover data for different, well, right. So with the land cover analysis, there's places in different cities have different ways of classifying land cover, but Dexter sent me a link to some land cover data for Baltimore. They have great land cover data, and like San Francisco has great land cover data, so I think that there's definitely some potential for doing that. Do I have time for more questions? Okay, Lisa.
So thinking about the leverage points and some of the socioeconomic issues,
Mm-hmm.
are there, I know that a lot of schools use these,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering if there's a way for you to sort of look at how maybe some of those road effects or school busing routes or anything like that might be able to tease out some of those issues
Yeah.
because of, just assignments and quantities and repeat observations would be along those.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I've been told, I haven't been to Chicago enough to know a lot about this, but I've been told that there are some very strong patterns across the city of there being majorly underserved communities in terms of things like public transport, and that also might have an influence on some of these patterns. I know that's not like what you're getting at, but yeah, but I think that could be really informative. The advantage of having Emily and working in Chicago is that she knows a lot about this stuff, so I'll be sure to ask her about that. Yeah, Jim.
I remember from a proposaler that we had a workshop here on the social media data that this kind of gets back to what Margaret was getting at, that there was the possibility you could relate a user to their home address.
Yes.
But wouldn't that
So
allow you to get
in Flickr, you can, and that's what I was talking about with like looking at a lot of people look at tourists versus non-tourists because they have a hometown. A lot of people have a hometown on there, not everybody. With Twitter, which I'm not using this, so never mind. I think that I can't remember if you can or can't. I think maybe people still sometimes put that information, but it's much less common. And then with eBird and iNaturalist, I don't think that information is available. But
just one final hometown observation. had that pattern of dense observation along what you called roads. Those aren't actually roads; those are frickin' expressways.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder
What's going on?
what's going on,
Yeah.
and are people stuck in traffic?
Oh, could be a traffic thing. I figured it was commuting.
It's a little disturbing, quite honestly, but like who's?
I mean, they might all be hawks. So,
Yeah.
you know, but I haven't actually looked at that yet. So.
But the thought it triggers too is maybe stratifying. Presumably, people on an expressway are absolutely should not associate with the local neighborhood.
I was just thinking about this when I was putting this together yesterday. It was like, what about these roads? And I'm putting those in a neighborhood. Those
Yeah.
might be, should maybe
So maybe
come
some
out of that
arterial
neighborhood.
designation could allow you to stratify. Well, if you're on expressway, you're definitely not local. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks. You know,
Where's yours?
It's down at the bottom.
Ah.
Didn't I like minimize it?
Oh, did you?
Yeah. See,
You already had it open?
one letter for Jason. Sad.
Aw. All right, I'm gonna go get my notebook.
I need to figure out how to put on the thing, don't I? Aren't you still wearing it? Or do I need to put it on?
I am still wearing it.
yeah, there's
And I totally like grabbed it while I was talking. Oh! I'm tripping on wires.
Me. Elizabeth. So do I just hold it? What am I supposed to do with this? One, because I'm wearing a dress, which I wasn't aware of the thing, so should I hold it? I mean, what am I supposed to do with any of this?
Yeah, I got you.
I mean, you know, good information that I didn't have.
Are you gonna walk around?
This area, I mean, I could just put it there, I guess. That's fine, I don't care. I'm not gonna circulate the room. That's what you're asking.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
Cool.
Okay, that should be good.
Awesome. Okay, cool. All right, good morning, all of you. I'm Maya Call, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing about birds and other things like that, because there's going to be none of that in this talk. We're going to be really focusing on people, so sorry to all the ecologists in the room. But this is work on climate migration and gender in Asia. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on this portion of it that examines climate migration in Indonesia, and this is work that I'm doing with my collaborator, Lori Hunter, who's a sociologist and an environmental migration researcher located at University of Colorado at Boulder. So, why should we care at all about this topic? Since we're now moving to really much more of a global scope, and specifically sort of a developing or global south context. First of all, climate migration. I imagine all of you have heard of climate migration. You may have heard of environmental refugees or those kinds of concepts. They're still very popular in the New York Times, the Atlantic. You know, lots of magazines like to use this as like a sexy way to pull people in, like, oh my God, millions of people are going to be moving due to sea level rise, you know, rising temperatures, etc. And that was also like the scientific sort of, I guess consensus, it is the IPCC in 1990. But thankfully, we've come a long way since then. And we no longer, we've moved away from this very like reductionist and reactionary approach of saying, you know, this pressure will therefore cause this very specific and universal outcome. Now the IPCC says the dynamics of the interactions of mobility with climate change are multifaceted and direct causation is difficult to establish. And what this means in person language is we know that different environmental factors are going to cause different kinds of migration outcomes for different people in different places. So the only thing we're really certain of is that we really do not know what's going on. We've seen a lot of different outcomes, and this is still a very important topic for research, despite the fact that there is a growing body of literature that's focused on it. At the same time, there's been kind of a parallel body of literature that's been developing around the concept of gendered climate adaptation. And
I use gendered here instead of like sex because I'm talking about actually gender roles that are kind of causing these differences in outcomes, not like I'm not talking about biological sex. What really matters is the kinds of access to resources, education, labor opportunities, and those are embodied by gendered expectations and cultural differentiation in gender patterns. And basically what this literature has suggested so far is that men and women do often have different kinds of adaptation strategies and responses during periods of climate stress. For example, in a household, a woman might not be able to go to a local village to get wage labor if she hasn't had access to the appropriate amount of education, or she has to stay home and care for her children and fetch water and do other sorts of household tasks that take up a lot of time and might prevent that sort of access. And so out of this, there's been this growing interest in this concept of gendered climate migration. Do men and women tend to exhibit different patterns in regard to their migration practices when faced with, flooding or rising temperatures or, uncertain variable precipitation? And what we found is sort of like, we found two very different things. Well, in the case of Southeast Asia, where this project is focusing, we've actually found that women often have increased probability of migration during times of climate stress. But conversely, in sub-Saharan Africa, we've found that women have a reduced probability of migration while men have an increased probability of migration during these times. So there haven't been very many studies that have actually looked into this, although throwing in like a basic gender interaction term into your model has become pretty popular these days. Few of these studies try to go beyond that, and if we want to try to understand what's going on, the mechanisms that might be behind these processes, which are really important for gender nuanced climate adaptation, then we need to move beyond simply interacting gender with precipitation and saying, oh man, men are migrating more. So with that in mind, there are three sort of research questions that are kind of like overarching this whole project, and that I will be also focusing on for this talk on Indonesia. First of all, is climate a driver of migration in Asia? There's been a lot of different outcomes for this question. Secondly, does gender shape migration responses to climate stress? And we found some evidence that it does in the context of Southeast Asia, but nothing so far conclusive. And finally, we're moving into this, what social or cultural processes may be informing this relationship between gender and climate migration. And for this project, I propose to examine this question in the context of India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And all three of these different country contexts already exhibit different underlying migration patterns. The data are quite different between the three, and my idea is essentially to use similar methodological approaches to look at these patterns across these national contexts, all within the Southeast Asian region, and then to be able to try to start making some broader claims about these patterns based on being able to compare across these contexts. And so far, the part that I've worked on is the part focusing on Indonesia. So we'll be hearing about Indonesia. Why Indonesia? First of all, Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world. So simply, there are a lot of people there who are going to be impacted by climate stress. And it's also considered to be particularly vulnerable to climate change, both from a biophysical standpoint as well as from a social standpoint. In regard to the biophysical standpoint, this is an island nation in the South Pacific. So sea level rise is a thing that's going to happen. Temperatures are increasing, and many crops are pretty comfortable in a certain temperature range. And so when temperatures rise significantly above that, that can be very problematic. This is a very agricultural context. We also know that precipitation is likely to become uncertain and uneven. Monsoons might be coming earlier or later. And this can be very difficult when trying to plan your agricultural season. And flooding might increase. And also, of course, we may be seeing an increase of extreme weather events, and this is a region that's particularly impacted by that. On the social side, as I was mentioning, this is a very agricultural country context. About 40% of the population of Indonesia continues to rely on agriculture as their primary livelihood strategy. And so, and we know that climate change is going to be impacted by, we know that agriculture is going to be impacted by climate change. So, important. And finally, we also know this is a context in which there are still fairly strongly defined gender roles. Men and women may not have access to the same opportunities, the same educational, backgrounds. and those types of things. And this is, yeah, go into more detail about that later. So to do this, we're drawing together social survey data and biophysical climate data. And the social survey data that we're using are the Indonesian Family Life Survey data. And this is a survey that collected data from that continues actually to collect data from about 30,000 individuals, and is considered to be about 83% representative of the population. If you look at this map, you can see that the dark purple provinces are the provinces that are included in the Indonesian Family Life Survey, and it may appear that this is not the majority of the country, but this is actually where the majority of people live. The survey includes 5 waves of data. The data collection began in 1993/1994 and has continued on to 2014/2015. And this survey has a remarkably low attrition rate. Very few people have dropped out of this survey, which is pretty amazing. It's fewer than 10% of the original, households have fallen out of the survey at this point. This is because this survey is considered to be longitudinal at the individual level, by which I mean that individuals are actually tracked down, they're hunted down when they move so they can be surveyed again in their new households. And this is very different from most of these social surveys because it's very challenging to find people. One of the other surveys that does this tracking of people over time is the Mexican Migration Project, which some of you may be familiar with. They actually track down those people who have migrated and interview them again in their new context. This is really important for migration because once people leave, you don't necessarily know what their deal is if you don't have any follow-up on the individual, because they may not return to the household within the survey period. And this brings me to something else that's important for measuring migration outcomes about the survey, which is that it includes a retrospective migration module. And by this I mean that, say, in 2014, when the individuals were tracked down, they were asked questions about their migration decisions and where they went, why they went there, and when they went there for each of the years between 2007 and 2014. This is important because if you only had data from 2007 and then 2014 and didn't have any information in between, you might say, oh, well, they were in this household and then they appeared in this other household, but you wouldn't necessarily know when they left, why they left, what was going on there. And this also allows us to avoid issues of endogeneity because we draw our individual and household characteristics from, in this case, the 2007 wave of the survey, and then we draw our migration information from the 2014 wave of the survey. And so we're able to identify when they left the household and then associate that with the household and individual characteristics from the previous wave of the survey. Now, moving on to our modeled environmental data, for this, we're using the Modern Era Retrospective Analysis for Research and Applications product, MERA. And this is a data reanalysis product that has a daily temporal resolution as well as a spatial resolution of about a 1/2 degree latitude by a 0.67 degrees longitude, which is roughly 50 square kilometers at the equator. So now we'll talk about what I did and what I found. For the first research question, is climate a driver of migration in Indonesia? To analyze this question, I used an individual year data set from 2007 to 2014. As I was just explaining a moment ago, what I mean by this is that I got all of my individual and household characteristics, such as the gender, the sex, household wealth, those types of factors I got from the 2007 survey. And then I created a data set for each year between 2007 and 2014, in which I indicated whether or not someone migrated from the community during that time per year. And after they have migrated, they fall out of the survey. They're not part of the analysis framework. And here I'm only examining first out migration from the community because it's really important to know where someone is if you want to know if some kind of climate pressure is forcing them to move or preventing them from moving. And in this survey, they only collected community characteristics from the original 314 communities. And once someone actually leaves that community because they're engaging in a migration event, where they go is we're not provided with that information at that fine of a scale to be able to say this is the community they were in, this is where they went in 2008, this is where they went in 2009. So we know when they leave the community, but at that point they're no longer part of the data set we're looking at. And also, once they move between, like, say, 2007 and 2008, we don't know what their household structure is like in their new location, all kinds of factors. So we're just focusing on this first out-migration from the community. And what this results in is a sample size of about 74,717 person years. Oh, and the reason we're focusing on just these two waves, the 2007 to 2014 waves, there's a few different factors, but for me, one of the most important reasons I decided to focus on this period is that we're interested in how these gendered patterns are currently occurring and how they may occur into the future. And the cultural context of Indonesia has changed a lot since 1993. And so things that we might see going on in, say, 1993, 1994 are not necessarily reflective of gendered patterns that we might be seeing today or, into the future. So we're interested in this kind of more contemporaneous portrait. Also, this has been a particularly biophysically and politically stable time in Indonesia comparative to the past. And so we can avoid potentially seeing some of these things that might be screwing up what we're observing in our...
What's a person year?
It is literally a person and the year they're in. So like you would be like 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. It's like a data structure thing, but you're associated. It's like if your data is in like a long format. Yeah, it's not the number of people because not every person is actually present in every person year. If they leave the survey, say in 2009, then they're not. We don't know anything about them between 2009 and then 2014 when they're surveyed again. Yeah. So yeah, it's not the number of people. Okay. And so we're looking at 3 different outcome types here. We're looking at migration distance, migration destination, and migration motivation. Which it's nice that we can get all of this information from the survey because if any of you have looked at this kind of a question before, a lot of the time we just know if they left. But here, because of this retrospective migration module, we can get a little bit deeper into that. And so for migration distance, we have, of course, no migration within province or short distance migration, and beyond province or long distance migration. For migration destination, we have, of course, they didn't migrate, and then we have village migration, small town migration, and then city migration outcome. And finally, migration motivation. People gave a lot of different responses for this, but I've lumped it into they didn't migrate, they migrated explicitly for labor purposes, or they were engaged in a non-labor migration, which could be anything from they moved for educational purposes or they got married. And this sample size is people between the ages of 15 and 49, so they definitely could have been involved in any of those processes during that time. And finally, our predictors. We have our climate factors of interest here, as well as our individual and household predictors. And individual and household predictors or controls are things like, in this case, like age, gender, household wealth, those types of factors. And so, in regard to our climate factors here, we are using z-scores, which are measures of deviation of the annual monsoon onset timing and annual temperature using a 30-year climate mean. And some of you may note that precipitation was not mentioned here specifically. And that is not because I didn't look at precipitation. It's simply that, as many other studies have found, there was not a strong precipitation effect in regard to migration in this context. And the reason I'm focusing on this annual monsoon onset timing variable is that several previous studies have observed that the actual timing of the monsoon is often much more important than the quantity of the monsoon, because this is an area that focuses very heavily on rice cultivation, rice paddy cultivation, and this requires a lot of rain to work properly. And there's still also not very much irrigation here compared to many other contexts. And so if the monsoon is late, the hunger season can extend significantly longer into the winter, and that can be really hard for people to cope with. And if the monsoon season is early, that can also be problematic, because actually I just saw a paper at a conference like 2 days ago where they had actually found that the earlier monsoon seasons were often the heavier rainfall monsoon seasons, which increase flooding, and that can be also problematic. So it's that Goldilocks timing. And so in regard to our modeling strategy here, we use multinomial logistic regressions with fixed effects for province and year. And I use province as opposed to community fixed effects because community fixed effects did not produce a better estimate and didn't change it was robust against changing between community and province fixed effects. And considering the sample size, et cetera, I decided to go with the province fixed effects. So what did we find? We found, first of all, that temperature, specifically nonlinear effects of temperature, did have a significant relationship with beyond province labor migration to cities and small towns. And what that looks like, just focusing on this long distance migration probability, is that when temperatures are significantly lower than they normally are or higher than they normally are, this increases the probability of migrating for people. And we attribute this to, these are times when agricultural conditions are not exactly ideal, and this may be leading to people migrating for labor purposes. And as we saw here, they were migrating for labor reasons, and they were migrating beyond province, potentially to the cities or small towns to engage in wage labor. So moving on to monsoon timing, here we found specifically a nonlinear effect of monsoon timing, and it was in the opposite direction. So examining this, you can see that during times when the monsoon was particularly early or particularly late, we see a reduction in the probability of migration. And I attribute this basically to, these are times in which, I think with the early monsoon timing, after talking to my colleague at the conference, this may be times of flooding, when people potentially were losing assets through that mechanism and therefore won't have the assets to migrate. And during the later monsoon timing, I mean, if this hunger season has been extended significantly, people are not going to necessarily be able to afford to send people to migrate to a city or small town to engage in wage labor, even if that might be a more optimal livelihood strategy for the household. So moving on to our second research question. Yes?
Did you explore at all, so you're looking at these climatic effects in the year of migration. What about lags? Like, it could be really hard to move, and maybe it's your last year's experience that mattered more than...
I did look at the year before and didn't find any significant effects, but I haven't gone back a series of years at this point, although I have in previous research. And I did find significant differences in these more like long-term climate stressors and migration effects. So it could be a good direction to move this in. So talking about gender and migration responses, same data set, same outcome types, same predictors, except here I also include just what I was making fun of before, the interaction of gender and climate factors, and I use the same modeling strategy. And so what I find, and I found this to be, I was like not thrilled when I found this, but I didn't actually find any strong direct gender effects in these data. And so, of course, we push on. So here, I moved on to the third part of my analysis, which is examining what social or cultural processes may be informing this relationship between gender and climate migration. And for this, I used, once again, same data set, outcome types, the same predictors, except I also included this three-way interaction term. And I interacted the climate factors and the gender with these different individual and household factors. In regard to the individual factors, I looked at education level of the individual at the start of the period, as well as the marital status of the individual. And in regard to the household factors, I looked at household wealth, whether they were in a rural or urban locality, and also household livelihood strategies. Is this a household that's engaged in agriculture? Is this a household that has a small non-farm business of some kind? And the same modeling approach. So I'm going to talk in the interest of time about one individual interaction and one household interaction. First, the individual interaction. I don't know why I was surprised to see this, but I was interested to find that there was a very different relationship between marital status, gender, and temperature, both the nonlinear and the linear effects in these data. And so what that looks like, just to make it a little easier to examine, is that as temperatures increase, most people's probability of migrating actually is on the decline. However, this is not the case for single women. Single women have an increased probability of migrating as temperatures increase. And at first I was like, what's going on? But then I looked more into the literature, specifically somewhat the qualitative literature, and what I observed is that single women already have a really high probability of migrating in this context, specifically to cities to work in factories. It's considered a clean, modern form of employment and a way to get an experience of modernity prior to getting married. And so what we think we're seeing here is that as temperatures increase, this is simply like ramping up the probability of this happening, likely for the purpose of sending home remittances. And someone had previously asked me, do I think these people are just getting married? No, I don't, because these are labor migrations. So, and they specifically indicate these women are engaging in labor migrations. In regard to a household, an interesting household factor, here I'm looking at household has a farm, or basically, is this an agricultural household interacted with gender and temperature? And what I find here is that for most people in this context, temperature stress, as we saw in the original graph, increases the probability of migrating. However, not so for men with farm businesses. They actually have reduced probability of migrating during times of above and below average temperatures. And I attribute this to, these are times in which they may need to be putting additional labor in on the farm in order to maintain. And this is something I've found in previous research in sub-Saharan Africa, is that these, these times of above and below average temperatures do require investing greater labor. And unfortunately, this survey does not include an agricultural component, so I couldn't directly examine that. But yeah. So to conclude, temperature has a bigger impact than monsoon timing on Indonesian migration, which has been found by previous researchers, but this is just further evidence to that effect. Secondly, climate pressures are much more likely to moderate these existing migration patterns than they are to generate new patterns in our data. And I think this is, something that we all need to think about when we're thinking about climate as a driver of migration, that this is something that might shift how certain relationships are working, but won't necessarily lead to these like large mass out-migrations that people once predicted. And finally, gendered climate migration is socio-demographically complicated, and we're going to be really remiss if we try to lump all men and all women into two categories and say, well, men do this and women do this. It's still true in the developing world, men and women don't all do the same things. So we need to be thinking about, digging further into what may be going on with some of these patterns and relationships. Thank you. Yes, Colin.
Can you tell if people died from the cohort data?
Yes, there is information on that, and I didn't include people who died in this.
So, could you, if food insecurity is a big enough issue, do you think there would be any differential effect in terms of mortality, in terms of migration as a strategy? Does it have
For households who have members who die, or what are you thinking?
So what I'm wondering is, if, let's say you're migrating because of food insecurity or because of other things, like, for instance, this is a cholera endemic region, which is linked to monsoons, which gets warmed with climate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that you could find a signal of migration as basically a survival strategy? Or is it too noisy?
I don't know. It's an interesting idea, and I'm actually going to a workshop in a couple weeks on trapped populations, climate, migration, and health. So, yeah, I'll talk with them about that too and see what people are thinking. So it's a good idea, though. Anyone else? Yes, Heather?
Does the data capture international?
Almost none of the migrations exhibited here are international migrations. And
Indonesia was like
it is,
big country.
but I'm only looking at people I can still find. And you know who drops out of surveys where they track individuals? People who move to other countries. So like these are only people who get tracked over time, and almost none of the people who are followed up on are those international migrants. So
So that might be partly why you weren't finding stuff, because I think Indonesia is one of those countries where there's a big like international domestic labor migration.
yeah, for sure. It's for sure, but this is specifically focusing on internal migration patterns. But I totally agree with you. There's just not like a good way to, unfortunately, really get at that, since we lose those people as soon as they leave the survey. Yeah. Yes, Betsy.
How did the data deal with married households? I'm a little confused about, did those men and women just cancel each other out because they both moved together?
Do you mean household migrations versus?
Well, I guess, or how do you separate men from women in a context like this?
These are individual.
Maybe married and the household moves together.
So these are individual migrations
Right.
out of the household. And so most of these households did not relocate over time. I did actually make a control variable for that. It's not in the model, but it didn't change the outcomes of the model. Like controlling for, did the whole household migrate? So I don't know if that answers your question. I can control for that, and it didn't cause any different effects. No. Yeah, because I mean, married men and women they don't really migrate very much. They have an extremely low probability of migrating. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Dexter?
What about the role of religion?
Almost every single person in this context practices the same religion, Islam. So maybe like 2% of the population of my survey is anything else, so it's not a significant factor. Thanks.
Should I just take it away?
Just go ahead.
All right. Let's talk about disease. So today I want to talk a little bit about 3 different stories. I think the best way to talk about health stuff is through storytelling a little bit. So there's not going to be too much methods in this talk. If you want methods answers, I will gladly give them to you. So what I think about a lot is getting things wrong. This is a big problem right now for ecologists in the health world, because for the last 10 years, there's a recurring theme, which is that at the start of a major outbreak, we say, oh no, we didn't see this one coming. And then at the end, we say, wow, we learned a lot. We won't do it again. And 2009, swine flu, we say, okay, we've learned about catastrophizing. And then in 2014, with Ebola, at the end of that epidemic, there were a lot of lessons learned, a lot of synthesis papers, similar things for Zika, an unprecedented level of international collaboration during the Zika pandemic. And still, we are struggling to get things right in the early stages of outbreaks. And somewhere in there are methodological constraints, because models can only be so good with limited data. But there's also, I think, really interesting questions about how we collect that data, what kind of models we're willing to invest in and put our trust in. And then there's a deeper question, which is how the rest of the world engages with those models. So my background is on the model building side, but now here I'm focusing a little bit more on how we work with those models. 3 stories, that's what I'm promising you. The first is about very, very basic ideas of prediction. Let's say you had a data set, 2 columns, country and pathogen. That's all it is. It's a really simple network. And every year, you record whether or not you see a particular disease in a country. So anthrax, which is what killed that zebra, is found in the United States, and it's found in China. Fully drug-resistant gonorrhea, a new and exciting player in the global health landscape, originated in the UK last year, actually in the hometown of a friend of mine. So that's a problem. And then new things are emerging all the time. 70% of those new diseases come from wildlife, which we call zoonotic diseases, or they have a tick or mosquito host, and we call those vector-borne diseases. That's going to come up a little bit. So on the bottom is a tick endemic to the northeastern parts of China, and it's spreading a new pathogen called severe fever with thrombocytopenia syndrome, or SFTS. And what we know about SFTS is basically nothing. We're at the start. And so when we're at the start, we can ask really basic questions like, where would it go next? If we know it's in China, what countries are more at risk? And if we think that things are limited by basic ecology, we could say, if the United States and China share more pathogens than the UK and China, maybe the US is more likely to get SFTS somewhere in the near future. So we built a model of this. And I'm going to say 3 words now that I hate saying in the following order. This is a predictor-free model. There's no covariates. There's no machine learning really happening except on the data itself. So we're training the network on the network to forecast the network. This seems like a kind of silly exercise, but it tells us something really interesting, which is what we can infer based on the structure of the data. In places where the model performs poorly, more complicated and interesting things are happening. So we use the area under the curve of the model as a metric of how well it's doing. Every year, we train the model on a set of data, so we might have 10 years of records, and then we try to predict which pathogens will be in which countries in a given year. So there's a lot going on here. I think the interesting takeaways are outbreaks up here, so something that's there pretty much consistently, are the easiest thing to predict. Reemergences, which means that things have been gone for at least 3 years but come back, we can still predict pretty well, which is nice. That's a good sign. True emergences, so the first time a pathogen is ever seen in a country, we're not doing any better than random.
So your y-axis is some measure of predictability?
Yeah, so AUC just tells us how good the model is doing. If it's better than 0.5, it's a little bit better than random. So that makes a lot of sense, right? If we've never seen something before, why would we be able to make any inferences on it? But then there's another cool thing nested within this data structure, which is that zoonotic diseases and vector-borne diseases are consistently harder to predict. And the reason that this is interesting is that there's no information on whether they're zoonotic or vector-borne in the model. There's no predictors going in here. It's just dissimilarity between countries. And so the takeaway is that if you strip out all of the other information, you strip out human social factors, you strip out ecological conditions, you strip out climate, and you're just left with the data we have available. It's a little bit harder to work with new things, and it's a little bit harder to work with things that are crossing boundaries between species. So that sets the stage for forecasting as a problem. We can hindcast really well with this model. So what we know now tells us a lot about how things have been. We try to forecast into the future, and everything breaks down pretty quickly. There's an extra problem here, which is that sometimes crazy things happen at a global scale. So model performance across the board, across countries, across systems, drops in 2009. For some reason, we just can't predict what happened in 2009. Does anyone have a guess why that is? That was our first thought. Maybe the financial crisis set off a bunch of weird outbreaks, but we don't actually have evidence of that. It's data collection. So 2009 is the swine flu pandemic, H1N1, right? And because of the H1N1 pandemic and really widespread fears about it, surveillance got really good for a very short time in a lot of countries. And we recorded a lot of things we otherwise don't. And we can't predict them. And so the way that you know that this is true is that virus prediction is the worst in 2009, but everything else drops with it. And so this sets the stage for what I want to tell you about today, which is when we put predictors back in, how much do we trust the models we make? And how do we appropriately communicate the fact that for zoonotic diseases, for vector-borne diseases, for early epidemics, we're making a little bit more tenuous predictions? So I want to talk about Zika as a nice gateway into this, because I think it sets up a lot of why these things are challenging. So Zika has been known since 1947, but it's slowly been spreading around the world, first from Africa, through Southeast Asia, across the Pacific over about a decade, and now into Brazil, where it was noticed for causing abnormally high levels of microcephaly, fetal birth defects. The Zika pandemic is not the deadliest in history. In fact, it's not very deadly at all. But it's an unprecedented social challenge because it brings together not just prediction issues, the challenges of working with a pandemic. It also has a lot of social factors rolled in. When we talk about Zika, we have to talk about access to contraception. We have to talk about safe and legal abortion and whether or not that's available. And those aren't easy things. And a lot of ecologists, myself included, aren't trained to do that. So when we come to the table with models, we're bringing our own expertise, but we're stepping into very unfamiliar territory. This is something I threw together in my dissertation. So this is a risk map for Zika. This is a species distribution model. When we make those for diseases, what we're essentially modeling is suitability, right? Because diseases break the first assumption of SDMs because they don't have static ranges. They're not at equilibrium, basically ever. And so this is a risk map for where we think Zika could be transmitted. It's based on very limited data. So these blue points are historical records. Red points are from the 2015 pandemic. We threw this together, I would say, 6 months into the pandemic. The thing about making models like this is that it's very easy, low-hanging fruit, which is why we make them. They're easy to build when you have no other data available than a set of points on a map. And that means that other people make them too. And it turns out that despite SDMs being a pretty common thing in ecology for going on 2 decades now, there's next to no effort put into consensus building after the fact. And that's fine a lot of the time because we usually make SDMs in a way that's very connected to a product. So someone says, I want to save the ivory-billed woodpecker, and you make a map, and then you build a protected area around its range, or you don't, it goes extinct, which is actually what happened. But there's deliverables linked to models. With disease modeling, that's not always true. A study actually just came out looking at basically every risk map that's been made for pathogens in Cameroon, and they showed that not one of the papers had a single author from Cameroon. There's a big disconnect, especially at the global scale. So the lack of a post hoc consensus raises questions about whether people are using models in informed and reasonable ways. So we did a study that showed just how big a problem this is. We take those 3 maps, we resolve them at the county level. So we say, is there anywhere within a given county in the United States that could transmit Zika virus in these 3 interpretations of ecology? And then we simulate epidemics. Every epidemic happens at the county level. These are really, really simplified. They're not biologically realistic. They're a tool for exploring how big an issue these downstream uncertainties are. Because normally people don't talk about it. People don't talk about the fact that they'll usually select one of these models and just run with it. Contained within these 3 models for the United States is a margin of uncertainty of about 6 million people at risk, which is, from where I stand, unacceptable. Not in the sense that it means we shouldn't have these models or that the models are built wrong, but that when we run with one of them and we don't talk about the assumptions we're making, we don't talk about the fact that there's subjectivity involved in that and, frankly, a little bit of randomness, we're picking one of these 3 interpretations, and maybe we're right and maybe we're not. So one way we could get around this is to just stop making niche models forever. And to be honest, this is what a lot of public health people would be content for us to do, because, oh Jesus, that's not great. That's not helpful to decision makers. So what if instead we make mechanistic models? So these are 2 maps. The darker the color in red, the more months of the year experimental evidence shows transmission is possible for diseases carried by these 2 mosquitoes. Aedes aegypti is the one that we're mostly interested in for Zika virus, but there's also things like dengue and chikungunya and West Nile virus all thrown in there as well. But this is an alternative. Instead of making these, phenomenological, limited data early outbreak models, could we just default to this?
Can you tell us what you mean by mechanistic model? Is it a process-based model?
Yes. So they spend about a year compiling experimental records of transmission. There's very, very well-developed models of how transmission works in terms of timing and transmission rates. And so they compile all that evidence, they do a meta-analysis, and they fit a curve for all the parameters, and then you get this Bayesian these are credible intervals projected onto space for whether at a certain temperature transmission should be possible. So this is based on hardcore empirical evidence, which is very, very different than the world that I'm coming from as a distribution modeler. And frankly, it's a little bit more credible because there's no model fitting happening except at the experimental level. But the reality is that putting out these models doesn't resolve the consensus. It makes the problem more complicated. It puts another model out there that journalists might use pictures of in their articles. We don't build consensus between the mechanistic models and the phenomenological ones, and people are still left sticking with their own interpretation. So we built a consensus model. And this is really the first time that this has been tried. It's just a majority rule. So if 2 out of 3 models say it's there, we think it's there. And then on top of that, we use the mechanistic model to show the number of months of suitability. So year-round in the tropics, there's this belt where transmission is possible. And then in particular places like the Southeast United States, southern Brazil, a lot of China, there's these zones of possible seasonal outbreaks where we want to focus very heavily on seasonal surveillance. So this is all a very academic exercise until it's not. If we zoom back into the US, we can develop a county-level understanding of where we think and when we think transmission is possible, and that lets us deal with ongoing issues. So during the course of the Zika outbreak, this very unfortunate thing happened where pesticide spraying became very common in a lot of the Southeast, and the people who were doing that weren't necessarily talking to farmers. So apiculture took a pretty big hit from this in South Carolina. Millions of bees died, which I learned in the process of writing this paper is actually not that many bees, all things considered. That's like 10 hives. But it's still a major loss if you keep bees for a living. And so we just got a paper accepted actually last Friday, talking about the downstream implications of this uncertainty for policymaking. So every state has its own laws in terms of whether beekeepers have to be notified about pesticide spraying, how they're allowed to deal with it, what pesticides are allowed. Now we can use these maps to say, first of all, here are the counties that are actually at risk. Outside of this, there's not a scientific consensus that indicates you need to spray in the first place. In the counties at risk, we now have a set of guidelines for here's where policy currently stands, here's where we could do a better job of notifying beekeepers before we do these big sprayings. So this is a different side of social vulnerability than maybe we're used to when we're thinking about health. But these things are all connected, and they all trace back at the end of the day to the fact that ecologists didn't really have a good sense of whether most of the US could have a Zika outbreak. As it stands, there were 227 cases split between Florida and Texas in 2016, and there has not been a single local transmitted case since. We're not as at risk
and
as...
those were locally transmitted, or was that?
That was all local. So there's been a few thousand more travelers. And for what it's worth, because no one ever mentions it, there were 30,000 cases in Puerto Rico, which is part of the US. And we all like to forget that. But yeah, so that's Zika. I want to pivot a little bit to what I've been doing for the last month. If you haven't seen me a lot in the last month, it's because I've been putting together the last touches on this, and I'm really excited about it. So anthrax is a weird one, because we've all heard of it in the context of bioterrorism vaguely, and then probably not any other context, unless you have the unfortunate privilege of sharing an office with me. Anthrax is a zoonotic disease. It's primarily a disease of herbivores. And it's worth pointing out that unlike Zika, which is this big abnormal event, this big pandemic that kind of came out of nowhere, anthrax is a normal part of ecosystems. It's not causing mass mortality and die-offs. It's not a major global threat to conservation. It's not a major global threat to human health. It's so neglected as a tropical disease that in the big tropical disease burden study that measured neglected diseases, they didn't even mention it. But it matters because it has a huge impact on agriculture and then on people. So a little bit about the life cycle before we get into what I've been doing. Spores go out of a host when it dies. So this zebra did something very dumb. It ate some anthrax. Never eat anthrax. That's the big takeaway of this talk. It died. It was scavenged. Blood and guts and all the nasty things that I like to work with go into the soil. And that's where anthrax wants to be, because then the next herbivore comes along and it eats some dirt, and then that thing gets anthrax. This affects livestock. And then when farmers are dealing with infected livestock, they can get it from contact with lesions or things like that. So this is a gastrointestinal exposure pathway for most herbivores. For humans, there's a cutaneous pathway if you come into contact with the skin of an animal, and that's not going to kill you. On the other hand, when poor livestock keepers have a dead cow that had anthrax, that's a lot of money down the drain. And maybe they don't want to tell people that it died of anthrax, and maybe they sell off the meat quietly. And then people are eating anthrax-contaminated meat, and that kills them. So this is a disease that is tied to poverty in weird and counterintuitive ways. It's not just through livestock also. So when there are big periods of food insecurity, people will eat infected wildlife. There was an outbreak in Zambia about 2 years ago where basically 39 dead hippopotamus floated down a river one day, and some folks said, this seems fine and normal. We're going to eat those like you do. And that did not go well. They did a follow-up study on this, and they educated local communities, and they said, this is what anthrax is. This is how it's transmitted. This is why everybody got anthrax very suddenly from this event. Are you going to do this again? Because that's the follow-up question that you always ask when you do these studies. And the answer was not an unequivocal no. Because if it's between no food and risky food, people are going to eat risky food. And so what we want to think about in the context of anthrax is, first of all, where is it? There's no global map. Second of all, who does it affect the most? And third of all, who's protected from it? This is where anthrax outbreaks are. Black points are records that go into our model. Darker colors towards orange and red are where outbreaks are. So these aren't cases, these are outbreaks. This could be anything from one person who touched a cow and got a little lesion to 100 people dead. And what we see is that there are a lot of really localized hotspots of outbreaks. Southern Africa, Ethiopia, there's kind of a belt up in here. And there are a lot of places where there's a lot of anthrax, but not a lot of outbreaks. Kazakhstan is a really good example of this. Kazakhstan has mostly got anthrax everywhere. There's a little belt of it that doesn't have it, but the north and the south both have huge, huge areas of suitability. And we know there is anthrax, but not a lot of outbreaks. The reason for that disconnect is entirely social. And so this is what we want to tease apart with this study. This is the first map of where anthrax is in the world. We are decades overdue on making this. And what we see is that there are areas of suitability on every inhabited continent. I want you to pay attention to a few big chunks.
Soil?
Yes, soil's the big constraint. There's a couple really big drivers. pH is one of them. It determines whether spores can actually hang out in the soil for long times. Under the right conditions, spores can persist for maybe 40 years. This is a huge problem for eradication because you can think the pathogen is gone and then it's back. We're going to come back to that. So soil is a big issue. NDVI is a big issue. So seasonal vegetation fluctuations explain a lot of risk because when there's a season with very limited vegetation, herbivores are eating a lot of dirt. They're grazing very close to the ground, and then they're getting a lot of spores. So those two things, and some other predictors, but mostly those two, make this happen. So big chunks that are interesting. This is not so much interesting to us. There's agriculture there, but anthrax vaccination is very readily available in the United States for livestock keepers. And industrial agriculture, it's all the easier to vaccinate your livestock. These two belts are a much bigger problem. Sub-Saharan Africa has a huge number of vulnerable, rural, poor livestock keepers, and a lot of the agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa is concentrated in these places. A lot of Western Europe is vulnerable, but they get very sporadic cases. That's not interesting to us. The Central Asia and East Asia regions are a little bit more interesting. So when we have a map like this, what we then do is we publish it and we say, here's where all the people are within these regions. And right now, again, ecologists are using very crude ways of thinking about risk. So we take this and we take a grid of people and we overlay them, and we call it population at risk. There was a big headline during the Zika pandemic that said 2 billion people at risk of Zika. And I want to put in perspective why that's an absolutely asinine thing for us to do. There are 7 billion people currently at risk of HIV. Everyone in this room is at risk of HIV because there's no ecological niche to it. Anywhere in the world, HIV transmission is possible. And so it's an absolutely meaningless metric unless you are resolving risk in some meaningful way. And so what we want to do with this study is say, instead of saying, there's 2 billion people, here they are, can we actually talk about populations at risk at this very global level in informative and policy relevant ways? The way that we do that is we think about poor livestock keepers and where they are. The biggest population at risk is coming from East and South Asia, because there's these huge population centers in China and India that basically absorb most of the population at risk. And you'll notice that this is where there's a lot of urban populations. Nobody in urban environments is getting anthrax. This is a really misleading way of doing risk communication, and we do it for every disease right now. This is the gold standard for talking about global burden when we can't estimate actual cases. And for most things, like anthrax, we can't reliably do that. So we could say 1.8 billion people are at risk of anthrax. That's not meaningful. There's somewhere between 50 and 100,000 cases every year in humans. 1.8 billion is not a useful measure. So instead what we do is we say, where are the poor livestock keepers living who are at risk of this? Because that's actually an exposure pathway. And what we see is that South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are the two places we're most interested in. Anthrax is best studied in Sub-Saharan Africa. We have long-term research sites like Etosha National Park or Kruger National Park, where we've watched anthrax for 40 years. And we have a really good handle on how it's transmitted, what it's doing, what the dynamics are. We can even start to build predictive models. Not so much in Southern Asia, and that's going to be a big issue going into the future. So we have a sense of population at risk, but even this doesn't tell us that much because people aren't getting it directly from the soil. 5 minutes? Okay. So the next thing we do is we do livestock at risk. And incredibly enough, these numbers all line up perfectly, which is why I didn't put up a table. I actually think it's a cardinal sin to put a table in a talk in the first place, but I'm excusing it this once. So we know that these are the regions that we're interested in. The next question then has to do with, are people protected from anthrax? It's really treatable by antibiotics in a lot of cases. GI pathway, not so much, but cutaneous anthrax is very treatable. The problem is that antibiotics are not available in a lot of places. And what we would rather understand is where people are able to vaccinate livestock. If you vaccinate livestock, people aren't getting it in the first place. The problem is that it turns out that most of the livestock vaccination in the world is done after an outbreak starts. This is called ring vaccination, right? So one cow gets anthrax, you kill that cow, you absorb the loss, and then you vaccinate all of the cows that were grazing in the same area. This isn't a good way to prevent outbreaks. It's a good way to control them. So I've spent the last month huddled over a computer making this one map. And it has been grueling because livestock vaccination numbers have to be reported to the UN through something called WAHIS. And WAHIS has a database. And I don't personally know why this would be the case, but their database is incredibly broken and they won't share data despite the fact that the interface doesn't work. And that's the only reliable source of livestock vaccination data. So we built a scraper to get around it. And if you should ever want livestock vaccination data for any reason, I'm not so subtly plugging it because I think it's unreasonable that they don't address this relatively large problem. So we now have the tool to think about things like this, and we can look at vaccination trends around the world. Couple things. Dark gray means there's no vaccination happening. There's a couple of cases where this is definitely untrue. For instance, the United States. A cool fact is that the United States also doesn't report vaccine production, and we're the only country who plausibly gets away with this. Why? I don't know. These are the limitations of these kinds of data sets. What we do know is that we have pretty decent reporting in a lot of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa has a very small and targeted amount of vaccination. And this lines up with what we know, which is that outbreaks start, people bring in vaccines, and they try to control them. These numbers only go up to, for these sort of subtler greens, 10% vaccination. So this is not that effective. On the other hand, there's these big swaths of red. Does anyone want to guess why that chunk of the world is the way it is? It's a cool historical story. So the Soviet Union had a really good idea in the 1930s. It wasn't communism in this case. But the one nice thing about having a centralized communist healthcare infrastructure is that it makes vaccine distribution really effective for decades. So they had a great idea in the 30s. They said, let's stop using the vaccine that was made in South Africa, the Stern vaccine. Let's make our own vaccine. Really good, really effective. We're going to ship it everywhere in the Soviet Union, and we're going to vaccinate everything. Russia has its last reported anthrax case in this region, which is the hotspot we're interested in 1943. And for 70 years, there's no anthrax cases. And again, in a lot of the Soviet Union, vaccination brings this pretty much under control, and they have an extra level of caution built in. They start doing something no one else did. When there's an anthrax outbreak, they roll in concrete trucks and they pave over the soil that's contaminated. And so there's these big swaths of just concrete in the middle of fields, completely unexplained. And that's how they solved the problem. And then the Soviet Union dissolved. And it's not good when that happens for healthcare infrastructure, because suddenly there's no more anthrax control. And so for a very brief period, vaccinations get weird and faulty. And then everyone suddenly realizes all at once, oh my God, we have to keep doing this, because people weren't maintaining the concrete slabs, people weren't maintaining records of where anthrax was, and cases came back. And so now what we can see is there's this weird legacy of the Soviet Union where there's still incredible vaccine coverage throughout these countries. In fact, in a lot of them, the number of doses reported is more than the number of livestock reported, which means that they are boosting immunity within a given year. This is incomparable to the rest of the world. So we're looking at 75 to 100% vaccination in this huge chunk of the world, and then we're down to 2 or 3% in sub-Saharan Africa, and I want to leave this on one really weird cautionary note. If you look at this map and you look at vulnerability, you can say there's this huge chunk of risk in West Africa. There's a lot of poor livestock keepers. They have very limited access to infrastructure. We know there's anthrax there. We know there's livestock there. Let's send vaccines. Turns out there's a weird mutation in the anthrax endemic to that region that probably causes vaccine escapes. And so we can go from this to say, all right, here are the regions that we need to target. And for West Africa, which is, I would argue, the biggest open problem, we still got nothing. This is the work. It doesn't always go the way you want it to, but we have a sense of risk now, and that's something. That's it, folks.
Time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
So I thought that the CDC and other health organizations use the virulence transmission type models. I didn't know they used SDM. So what do you mean by there's a lack of consensus and there's a big problem?
Well, so it turns out that CDC, in the early stages of the Zika outbreak, they weren't even using the mechanistic models. So they have a map of where Aedes aegypti could be in the United States, because surveillance isn't actually that good in a lot of the Southeast. And so they're using SDMs for the vector as a proxy for transmission. That in itself is a huge issue, because in a lot of places where the vector is, transmission isn't. Aedes aegypti is present in the entire Southeast US, and we haven't had endemic dengue recorded in recent history. There's more complicated factors that limit transmission. And so the underlying motivation for the mechanistic and phenomenological models and all of this is to be able to give the CDC something more targeted and say, actually, no, you shouldn't just nuke the entire Southeast with pesticides. These are the actual counties at risk. The problem is that everyone is doing that with their own model. And then there's an extra layer of risk communication through journalism, where every time we publish one of these papers, we give journalists the maps, and then they use the maps in perpetuity. And people are seeing conflicting things to the point where there were PSAs in the Bay Area when I was doing my PhD saying, dump your standing water, Zika's coming. And that was not going to happen. There wasn't even good consensus about whether we had the mosquito. So it's tricky. Yep. There you go.
Hold this to your sweater.
This.
Sure. You can put this in the pocket.
Sure. It's working. Just this. It is. Yeah. Needs time. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Presenter view. So, it's really hard to go after all these wonderful talks, especially since I don't, spoiler alert, I don't have many results to show today, and I won't talk much about methodology, but what I wanted to share with you is the project that I proposed. And so basically, I wanted to look at this multifunctional green infrastructure in cities and look at different ecosystem services that comes with it and trying to evaluate them for optimization of green infrastructure. And today I don't want to talk to a group of ecologists about ecosystem services, but I want to talk to you about why I think it's important for civil engineers to have this knowledge, and a little bit about my background. So a lot of you know I'm a civil engineer initially, and then I kind of did urban hydrology, and this is basically my background. So temporal and spatial impact of urbanization, land use, and land cover change. And then everything was observed through this lens of complex systems when I studied different properties. And in simple language, what I did is I analyzed stream flow records, and I did urban watershed modeling. And one thing that came up during my defense was people were asking me, okay, how would now civil engineers apply your research? Like, would it be easy? And I was like, yeah, sure. I can tell them, stop using mean and variance of streamflow records and stop using long-term memory entropy scaling. It's very easy, they will understand. Of course not. So for my project here, I wanted to actually do something that could be more, to say, actionable in the light of the last immersion workshop. So the proposal that I gave was for this SESYNC Microsoft call for proposals, where I had this data set that was developed, which was 1 meter land cover data set. And the most important thing was propose something about a project with this data set, something that falls well within SESYNC. So then I looked at the land cover, so you can see this is the 30-meter land cover and 1 meter comparison of the new 1 meter land cover, which is, this is actually a city. You can actually do something with this. Versus here you had, for urban areas, you can say that the land is developed, and you can say that it's low, medium, or high intensity. Versus here, now I have options of distinguishing structures, then roads, impervious surfaces. And this was an interesting category for me. 3 canopy over structures, over impervious surfaces, and over impervious roads. So a very nice data set. And I was thinking what to do with it, and then I always wanted to work with green infrastructure. And this is very nice, highly detailed data set. So this is from the actual website, a picture from the website. And then I started thinking, okay, my background is
urban modeling, but how does that relate to this? How can I use that in green infrastructure? So there's a couple of major constraints in urban areas is that there's a high number of stormwater inlets. So when you're dealing with this detail, it's very hard to distinguish the upstream area for the small projects. Then the distributed watershed models are really not thorough enough to handle such data. And then there was also that thing that green infrastructure implementation has been criticized, that is mainly used to emphasize only stormwater management, so reduction of water volumes and improvement of water quality. These are all the different names and different ways that people study urban green infrastructure. And they differ. Some of them are used in the United States, some in Europe, some are more common in Australia. Different speaking countries have different language, different ways to call them. For example, this one, I never heard of it, but apparently it's in France. But I was lucky to find this paper from 2015 by Fletcher, who actually, this is the second time that I thought of, oh, this would be a good paper summarizing these, and then he would have a paper on it. So he basically said all of this fall in the broad category of green infrastructure, but then you can, I apologize, this is a little bit unreadable, it's from his paper, but basically he divided them through specificity of the techniques that they use, like they use a specific techniques, or it's more concept-based, or it's a broader principles, and is it primarily for urban stormwater management, or is it a whole urban water cycle? Now, as I was doing my PhD, so I noticed that there's a big discrepancy between what engineers do in practical work versus what is in research. And also there's this knowledge that we can actually pull from them that we don't have, and that we would spend hours and hours reading papers where they can tell us, oh, these are the areas that you want to actually look at. So I was at this meeting at Philly explaining to them what I do with my project, and they were immediately going, oh, you should look at these watersheds, these have these problems, but these ones would be perfect for your study. So that's one thing that I definitely wanted to include, an engineering perspective, something that actually can be implemented. Then there's this long history of water resources management versus green infrastructure, where actually when you talk to a person who manages stormwater in cities, they don't like green infrastructure, period. And they're against it, and they have their reasons why. And usually it's very hard to convince them. So I wanted to touch upon something, why is this an issue? So when we think their issue is they need to solve the leaking pipes and aging infrastructure problem. Why is this an issue today? We can make robots that can mimic humans. We can send rockets to space and bring them back. Rockets, missions to different distant planets. We have computers that can do better, more. But then who's excited now about stormwater? So there's one thing that I really wanted to point out, that cities are these complex spatial systems. And when you actually go out and look at a city and say, oh, look, this is a perfect spot for a green infrastructure, there's enough space, we can do it, it's often not the case, because we forget that there is something beneath the city. This is a cross-section of a street, and this is all the infrastructure that is underneath the street. So we have sewage pipe, we have stormwater pipe, we can have the water pipe. Then we have the water drainage pipes along the streets. So we tend to forget that there is things buried underneath the city. And it's not only water and sewer, it's power lines, it's cable, telecom, steam, gas, and so on. And another issue with all these lines is that they create preferential pathways for water. So water can end up going where you're not intending it to go just because you have this infrastructure inside. And then when you look at history of cities, there's also another huge problem is that you don't go that much back in history. For example, in Belgrade, the time where I come from, we have infrastructure that dates from Roman times. There's parts of the city where you cannot dig a shovel and you'll find something. And then, but that's also the case in US. For example, in San Francisco, I found this, and this was fascinating. Underneath their port and underneath their financial district, there are actually buried ships. So I imagine different cities will have different issues. Then another huge issue for civil engineers is trees. They are not kind to infrastructure. They tend to grow inside pipes, causing clogging and making civil engineers bang their heads. There's also issue with leaves that are blocking storm drains and debris that is also blocking storm drains that somebody needs to clean up. And there needs to be funds to do this. Also, while I was at Penn State, there was this issue where they wanted to revamp a parking lot that was between landscape architectural building and agricultural engineering building. And the huge issue that they kept arguing about is that engineers didn't want to let architects put mulch next to the on the parking lot because of this problem. They know mulch usually clogs storm drains. But it's not all terrible. Now I want to talk about a place where I come from. So I know how beautiful it is to have natural environment in a city. This is actually from my favorite street that I took every day going to my university. And I loved it because in the warm weather, you can always find shade, and it was always cooler in this area. And generally, during the heat waves, which we would have over 40 Celsius, I apologize, I didn't look up the Fahrenheit, I think that's above 100. This area of town was always cooler. It was always nice coming back from this setting. So this is the downtown, so you can see it's not the whole city that's beautiful. In green, the downtown is very paved, very impervious. I don't know if you can see, but there's like a small planters here with flowers. This is actually the building where my university is, and this is a huge plateau that was always empty during these very, very hot days. Everybody was underneath these trees here. It was a cooler area, and a very nice thing was that the bus stop was here. So now, back from memory lane, back from civil engineers and their problems. What I wanted to look at this project is multifunctional green infrastructure. So ways to look past only managing stormwater and actually finding connections and finding ways of implementing infrastructure in a way that can actually help find ways to pay for it, if you want to say that, but actually finding people who can be interested in revamping the city, but actually being knowledgeable about all these issues and that they need to contribute to the actual aftermath of the implementation of green infrastructure. Now, I apologize. I didn't have time to actually go through all the steps, so now it's all bullet points, but these are kind of steps that I'm taking. So for my project, first I will choose, well, I'm in process of choosing ecological, social, and regulatory functions that can be used to add value to green infrastructure implementation. Then to identify places in the city where the green infrastructure can serve its multifunctionality, and see how these different solutions affect the evapotranspiration and climate and heat within the city. So the reason why I wanted to step away from stormwater is that people do not care about water. Unfortunately, but true. If you try to talk to them, in majority of cases, I'm not saying this is universal, but in majority of cases, they don't want to pay their stormwater fee. They're not interested. They only need to know that they have water when the tap is open and that everything is working while they flush. So I wanted to, because of my personal experience from my hometown, I wanted to incorporate that, and I wanted to see if we optimize green infrastructure to serve this multifunctional purpose, how will that affect evapotranspiration and heat in the study area. So these are some questions that I kind of wanted to ask. So is it possible to optimize green spaces to satisfy a multitude of functions? Is there any set of functions that is more easily combined? What is the most difficult function to satisfy and why? Then what will be the influence of prioritizing specific functions on the overall optimization, and how will these solutions compare? And in the end, considering all these optimized scenarios, what impact will they have on evapotranspiration and urban heat island stress? I started gathering data from Baltimore. I went and talked to their engineers, and I was happy to hear that some of my initial thoughts about civil engineering, and because all of my experience came from back home, that they actually relate here, and that they were telling me, yes, this is the issue. We had all these potential green infrastructure sightings, but when we actually looked at them, we couldn't use them because of various things, not to mention, I'm not sure why they didn't, but there's a lot of different factors to include when looking at the city. For example, foundation, they don't really like water. That is why we tend to move water away from cities. That was the initial idea. I know that it caused a myriad of problems later on, but that was the idea. And if you like living in a two-story house in a building, you don't want water near your foundations. I'm actually waiting on the data from them. They will provide green infrastructure locations and the locations that are considered for future implementations. And a nice thing about Baltimore is that they identified, they have, well, it's not a nice thing. They have a problem with vacant lots, but they identified them as a possibility for urban greening. And I just recently saw that they have this Baltimore Green Network Vision Plan. It's about to be released, and it has a lot about connectivity and biodiversity, areas that I'm really fuzzy. So I'm looking forward to pull from that knowledge. And I want to finish with this beautiful house that I took a picture while I was in Vienna. I apologize that you cannot see it. This is Hunderwasser, and Florian can correct me if I pronounce that Austrian name wrong. But it is one of the beautiful houses that integrates nature, and this is actually like a building. So, any questions? Sure.
What about the 1 meter land cover data that's most interesting to you in light of your questions?
Sorry?
What aspect of the 1 meter land cover data is most interesting to you in light of your questions moving forward?
Definitely, because you can distinguish what are green spaces versus what is impervious surfaces. And there's much more things you can do with that versus saying this is just low percentage of imperviousness. Distinguishing trees, distinguishing structures. For example, this is not a very good thing, but you can look at all the structures and say, I want to convert them into green roofs. There's an issue with that because usually buildings are not created, they're not built to withstand extra loading from the green roof. But that's like a potential thing that could be valuable to identify. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes.
It's very nice to work with this high definition images, but have you considered taking a look at radar images that gives you topography of the terrain? Also, if you put both information together.
Yes. Yes, there's. I'm definitely going to use additional data whenever I can find. Usually, in these urban areas, we have better digital elevation models. I'm considering of using also transportation data for air pollution, where we know that if there's a lot of traffic, a lot of there's a lot of pollution happening in those areas, so there will be a lot of additional data that will support this 1 meter.
And are you wondering to do some modeling of the water to evaluate, for instance, if you have a very large rain, if it's going to be a problem for the draining of the areas, if you're going to have flooding problems, or you don't use one?
I didn't consider flooding. There is value of certain green infrastructure in reducing flooding, but I haven't looked at it, to be honest. I haven't thought of it, but I'm definitely hesitant of using any hydrological modeling because I know that I can never get to 1 meter. When we're talking with 1 meter, it's still very, very not up to speed, the hydrological modeling.
So when the city was looking at doing some of the green infrastructure, they started out with 110 sites at the end of 2005.
Yes.
a lot of that was related to underground conflicts with electrical lines and things like that. I wonder, though, when you go to the vacant lots, you no longer have the underground conflicts. And how might your perspective on how to manage design systems when your z-axis actually changes substantially? Meaning, in what the city was dealing with, they could only go down 1 foot.
Yeah.
But if you could design green infrastructure that could go down 10 feet, and how would you design that, and like the changes in connectivity to the systems? Like when you're doing the small stuff, it's a bathtub, and then with the deeper, maybe like your opportunities for these systems could change.
Definitely. There's also issue there that those vacant lots needs to be in a specific place. They need to be in a specific place in a watershed of somewhere downstream that can collect a lot of water, and usually are very lucky if that happens.
Did you find your chocolate?
Yes. I didn't know this was for you, but that's very sweet.
Yes, I brought for everybody, and then I stacked some for you and Chris because you guys weren't here yesterday.
Did you have a good trip?